the dusty wooden sign swinging outside the general store in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, caught her eye not because she wanted to read it, but because she needed to look anywhere except at the growing pile of her belongings being laid out on the merchant's counter like her life was being dismantled piece by piece. Grace Coleman's hands trembled as she reached into the cloth bag slung over her shoulder, her fingers brushing against the silver locket that had belonged to her mother, and she knew with a sinking certainty that this too would have to go on that counter if she wanted to buy enough flour and milk to last another week. The baby strapped to her chest with a worn shawl stirred against her, and Grace automatically placed one protective hand over the small bundle, feeling the rapid heartbeat of her 3-month-old daughter against her palm. Little Mary had her father's dark hair and Grace's green eyes, though those eyes would never see their father again after the mine collapse 3 months back had taken him along with 17 other men from the settlement. The compensation from the mining company had been insultingly meager, barely enough to cover the burial, and Grace had been scraping by ever since on the small savings they had managed to put away. But those savings were gone now, every last cent spent on keeping a roof over their heads and food in Grace's belly so she could continue nursing Mary. The landlord had made it clear yesterday that if she did not come up with this month's rent by Friday, he would have no choice but to put her belongings on the street. Grace had spent the entire night staring at the ceiling of the small room she rented above the seamstress shop, trying to figure out how she had ended up here at 22 years old, a widow with a baby and nothing but the possessions she could carry. "Madam, I can give you maybe $2 for this lot," the merchant said, his voice not unkind but businesslike as he examined the embroidered tablecloth Grace's grandmother had made. "The locket might fetch another $1 if the silver is real, $3 total." Grace did the mathematics in her head quickly. That would buy enough supplies for perhaps 10 days if she was very careful, but it would not cover the rent. She would need to sell more, which meant the quilt folded at the bottom of her bag, the only warm covering she and Mary had for the approaching autumn nights. The thought made her throat tighten, but she forced herself to nod. "The silver is real," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "It was my mother's." The merchant looked uncomfortable, his weathered face creasing with sympathy. "These are hard times for a lot of folks, Mrs. Coleman. I wish I could offer more, but with the railroad construction slowing down, there ain't as many buyers coming through town." Grace understood. She did not blame him. She blamed the mine owners who cut corners on safety. She blamed the foreman who had sent the men down into those tunnels knowing the supports were weak. She blamed the universe itself for taking Thomas from her just when they were starting to build a life together. But mostly, late at night when Mary finally slept, she blamed herself for not being stronger, for not knowing how to provide for her child better. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Grace instinctively moved closer to the counter, trying to shield her belongings from view of whoever was entering. She did not want pity from the townspeople, did not want them to see how far she had fallen. But when she glanced over her shoulder, she saw it was a stranger, a tall man in dusty traveling clothes with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He moved through the store with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, his boots making solid sounds against the wooden floorboards. Grace caught a glimpse of his profile as he passed under one of the oil lamps, all sharp angles and sun-weathered skin, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the Badlands formations to the east. He carried himself like a man who had spent more time in the saddle than in towns, and there was something about the way his hand rested naturally near his hip that suggested he was familiar with the weight of a gun belt, even though he was not wearing one at the moment. Grace turned back to her transaction, trying to ignore the stranger's presence. She had no energy for curiosity about newcomers to Sioux Falls. She had only enough energy to survive each day and make sure Mary survived with her. "I will take the quilt too," she told the merchant quietly, reaching into her bag. "What can you give me for everything together?" The merchant's expression grew more uncomfortable. "Mrs. Coleman, are you sure? It is going to get cold soon, and you will need—" "I am sure," Grace interrupted, though her voice cracked slightly on the words. "I need the money now. I will manage with the cold later." She felt rather than saw the stranger pause in his browsing, sensed his attention shift toward their conversation. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the merchant, willing the transaction to be over quickly, so she could leave with whatever dignity she had left. Mary stirred again, making a small mewling sound, and Grace gently rocked her, murmuring soft, wordless comfort. The merchant sighed and pulled out a small leather purse from under the counter. $5 for the lot, Mrs. Coleman. That is the best I can do, and I am being generous with that price given current market conditions. $5. It was not enough for rent and food both. Grace would have to choose, and she already knew which choice she would make. Mary needed to eat. Everything else was secondary to that fundamental truth. She would go to the landlord and beg for an extension, promise to have the rent money within 2 weeks somehow. Maybe she could find work doing laundry, or perhaps the hotel needed someone to clean rooms. The work would be hard with a baby to care for, but Grace had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed since Mary's birth. "I will take it," she said, and began counting out the coins the merchant placed on the counter. 5 silver dollars, heavy and cold in her palm. The weight of her entire life reduced to metal discs that would be gone again in a few days. The stranger was suddenly beside her at the counter, and Grace caught the scent of leather and horse and the open prairie. He placed several items down, coffee and tobacco and a new rope, then gestured to Grace's belongings spread across the wood. "I will buy all of this," he said, his voice a low drawl that carried traces of Texas in its vowels. "How much is the lady asking?" Grace turned to stare at him, confused. Up close, she could see his eyes were a startling blue, the color of the sky just after dawn, set in a face that was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 26 or 27. There was a kindness in those eyes that surprised her, though his expression remained neutral. "Sir, I am selling these items to the store," Grace said carefully, uncertain what game this stranger was playing. "I understand that, madam," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "But I am interested in purchasing them myself, directly from you. Would save the merchant here the trouble of reselling them, and I expect you would get a fairer price dealing with me than with a middleman." The merchant looked between them, clearly uncertain about this development. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassment, and something else, something that might have been hope but felt too dangerous to name. "I do not need charity," she said quietly, lifting her chin. "I am selling these items because I need money, not because I want pity from strangers." The cowboy's expression did not change, but something flickered in those blue eyes, respect maybe. "Madam, I ain't offering charity. I am offering to buy some items I need. This tablecloth here, my mother would love something like that. And this locket, well, I have a sister back in Austin who is always complaining I never bring her nothing when I return from my travels. These other items, I can find uses for them. So I am asking you, as a legitimate business transaction, how much you want for this lot." Grace stared at him, trying to understand his angle, but his face gave nothing away except that strange kindness in his eyes. Mary chose that moment to begin fussing in earnest, and Grace had to focus on soothing her, bouncing gently and humming the little tune Thomas used to sing. "The merchant offered me $5 for everything," Grace finally said, watching the stranger's face for any reaction. He nodded slowly, then said, "I will give you $20. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Grace grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. $20. That is absurd. These items are not worth nearly that much. "That is for me to decide, madam," the cowboy said calmly. "Do we have a deal or not? I am in a hurry to get my shopping done and find a hot meal before the restaurant closes for the evening." The merchant was watching the exchange with wide eyes, clearly as stunned as Grace. $20 would cover her rent and food for at least 2 months, maybe 3 if she was very careful. It would give her time to find work, time to figure out a more permanent solution to her situation. But the price was so inflated that it could only be charity dressed up as a transaction, and Grace had been raised to earn her own way. "I cannot accept that much," she said, though the words hurt coming out. "It would not be right." The cowboy studied her for a long moment, and Grace had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen, of having all her desperation and pride and fear laid bare under that blue gaze. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and gently touched Mary's tiny hand where it had emerged from the shawl wrapping. Just a brief contact of his calloused fingertip against that perfect miniature hand. "Madam, I have been riding the trail for 3 years since my father passed, working cattle drives and breaking horses and doing whatever jobs come my way. I ain't got no family waiting on me except my mother and sister back in Texas, and I only see them maybe once a year if I am lucky. I have money in my pocket that I earned honest, and I want to spend some of it on items that will make them happy when I finally get home. Your tablecloth and locket, they are exactly the kind of things I have been looking for. The other items, I can use them on the trail. So please, let me buy these things at a price I am willing to pay. It ain't charity. It is a cowboy trying to make his mama smile." The way he said it, the absolute sincerity in his voice, made Grace's eyes burn with unshed tears. She did not know if she believed him, but she also did not have the luxury of refusing. Mary needed food. Grace needed to keep a roof over their heads. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "All right," she whispered. $20. The cowboy nodded and pulled a leather wallet from his vest pocket, counting out 4 $5 bills and laying them on the counter with the same care someone might handle something precious. Grace stared at the money, at the clean paper bills that represented survival, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "Thank you," she managed to say, though her voice was barely audible. "No need for thanks, madam," he replied, gathering up the items and handing them to the merchant. "Could you wrap these up for me? I will collect them after I finish my other shopping." The merchant nodded mutely and began wrapping the items in brown paper. The cowboy turned back to Grace, and she saw him hesitate, saw something like concern cross his features. "Madam, if you do not mind me asking, do you have somewhere safe to stay? Someone looking after you and the little one?" Grace straightened, trying to summon what remained of her dignity. "I have a room above the seamstress shop. We are managing just fine, thank you." It was a lie, and from the look on his face, the cowboy knew it was a lie, but he did not challenge her. Instead, he touched his hat brim again in that gesture of respect and said, "Well, if you or the baby ever need anything, I will be staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street for the next few weeks. Name is Cole Rutherford. You ask for me if there is trouble you hear." Grace did not know what to say to that, so she just nodded. Cole Rutherford returned to his shopping, and Grace carefully folded the $20 and tucked it into her bodice, against her heart where pickpockets could not reach it. She felt strange, unbalanced, like the world had shifted slightly off its axis. Strangers did not do things like this. Men did not hand over $20 for items worth a quarter of that without expecting something in return. But when Grace glanced over at Cole Rutherford examining cans of beans on the far shelf, he paid her no attention at all, seemed to have already forgotten about her entirely. It made her question her own cynicism. Maybe there were still good people in the world. Maybe Thomas had not been the only one. Grace left the general store quickly, before Cole could change his mind or before she could break down crying in front of everyone. She walked the 3 blocks to her rented room with Mary pressed close, feeling the weight of the bills against her chest with every breath. The late September sun was warm on her face, and for the first time in weeks, Grace let herself feel something other than despair. The room above the seamstress shop was tiny, barely large enough for the narrow bed and the small trunk that held Mary's few clothes. But it had a window that caught the morning light, and the seamstress, Mrs. Henderson, was a kind woman who often brought up leftover soup from her dinner. Grace paid her rent to Mrs. Henderson, who managed the building for the owner, and the older woman's eyes widened when Grace handed over not just this month's rent but next month's as well. "My goodness, Grace, did you come into some good fortune, Mrs. Henderson asked, counting the bills with her work-worn hands. "Someone bought some items from me," Grace said carefully, not wanting to explain the whole strange encounter. "I had some things to sell and I found a generous buyer, Mrs. Henderson looked like she wanted to ask more questions, but she was too polite to pry. Instead, she smiled and tucked the money into her apron pocket. "Well, I am glad for it, dear. You have been looking so worn down lately. Perhaps now you can get some proper rest." After Mrs. Henderson left, Grace fed Mary and then stood at the window, watching the street below as the afternoon faded into evening. She could see the main street from here, could watch the people of Sioux Falls going about their business. Somewhere out there was Cole Rutherford, the stranger who had just changed her life with a simple act of inexplicable generosity. Grace told herself not to think about him, that he would be gone in a few weeks, and she would never see him again. But her traitorous mind kept returning to those blue eyes, to the gentleness with which he had touched Mary's hand, to the respect in his voice when he had called her madam. Thomas had been dead for 3 months, and Grace had thought her heart had been buried with him. She was not looking for anything from any man, especially not a drifting cowboy who would disappear as suddenly as he had appeared. But that night, for the first time since Thomas's death, Grace dreamed of something other than darkness and loss. The next morning, Grace woke to Mary's hungry cries and the sound of rain pattering against the window. She fed the baby and then counted her money again, making sure the previous day had not been some desperate hallucination. The bills were still there, real and solid. Grace had $13 left after paying the rent. It felt like a fortune. She spent the morning doing laundry for Mrs. Henderson, earning a few extra coins and keeping herself busy. But by afternoon, when Mary was napping and the rain had stopped, Grace found herself walking toward the general store again. She told herself she needed to buy supplies, that it had nothing to do with potentially seeing Cole Rutherford again. The merchant greeted her warmly when she entered, clearly remembering the previous day's unusual transaction. Grace bought flour and cornmeal, salt and a small amount of sugar, dried beans and a precious tin of condensed milk for when her own milk might not be enough. She was carefully counting out coins when the bell chimed and Cole Rutherford walked in, shaking rain droplets from his hat. Their eyes met across the store, and Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish, and walked over to where she stood. Mrs. Coleman, he said, touching his hat brim. Good to see you again. Mr. Rutherford, Grace replied, her voice steadier than she felt. I wanted to thank you again for yesterday. Your generosity was unexpected and deeply appreciated. Cole waved a hand dismissively. Like I said, it was a fair transaction. How is the little one doing? Grace glanced down at Mary, sleeping peacefully in the sling against her chest. She is well. Growing stronger every day. That is good, Cole said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. Strong is good in this country. Takes strength to survive out here. The merchant finished wrapping Grace's purchases, and she carefully loaded them into the cloth bag she had brought. Cole watched her struggle with the weight, then gently took the bag from her hands. Let me help you carry this back to your place, he offered. Those supplies look heavy, and you have got the baby to manage too. Grace wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her independence, but the bag was heavy and she was tired, and there was something in Cole's expression that made her think he would be genuinely disappointed if she said no. So instead, she nodded. Thank you. That would be helpful. They walked through the muddy streets of Sioux Falls side by side, not speaking much but the silence feeling comfortable rather than awkward. Cole matched his long stride to her shorter one, and he held the bag of supplies like it weighed nothing at all. Grace found herself acutely aware of his presence, of the way he moved with that easy cowboy grace, of the strength evident in his shoulders and arms. When they reached the seamstress shop, Grace expected Cole to hand over the bag and leave, but instead he followed her up the narrow stairs to her room. She felt suddenly self-conscious about the small space, about the obviously threadbare quality of her belongings, but Cole's expression showed no judgment as he set the bag down on her small table. This is a nice place, he said, looking around. Gets good light from that window. It serves our needs, Grace replied, beginning to unpack the supplies. Mr. Rutherford, may I ask you something? Cole, please, he said. And yes, madam, you can ask me anything. Grace turned to face him fully, meeting those blue eyes directly. Why did you really do it? Yesterday, I mean. The amount you paid, it was far beyond reasonable. I know you said it was for your mother and sister, but I am not a fool. I know charity when I see it. Cole was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he moved to the window, looking out at the street below. You ever lose someone important to you, Mrs. Coleman? The question caught Grace off guard. My husband died 3 months ago. Mining accident. Cole nodded slowly. My father died 2 years back. Ranch accident. Horse threw him and he hit his head on a rock. Was dead before anyone could get to him. My mother, she was left to run the ranch on her own, and it nearly broke her. Not just the grief, but the practicality of it. All of a sudden, she was alone trying to manage a spread that took 3 men to run properly. Neighbors helped some, but mostly she struggled. I watched her sell off things she loved, things that had been in our family for generations, just to keep food on the table and pay the hands. He turned back to Grace, and she could see old pain in his eyes. I was young and stupid then, only 24, and I did not know how to help her, did not know how to step into my father's boots and be the man she needed. So I ran. Told myself I was going out to make my fortune, that I would come back when I had money saved up. But really, I was just scared and useless. Been riding the trails ever since, sending money home when I can, but never staying long enough to really help. Grace felt her heart contract with sympathy. I am sure your mother understands. Maybe, Cole said, but I do not know if I understand. Point is, when I saw you yesterday, standing there selling the last things you owned to feed your baby, it reminded me of my mother. Reminded me of all the times I could have helped someone and did not because I was too wrapped up in my own troubles. So I helped you. Not out of pity, but because it was something I could actually do, something concrete and real. Grace felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time she did not fight them. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being honest with me." Cole crossed the small room and stood in front of her, close enough that Grace had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You seem like a strong woman, Mrs. Coleman. Stronger than you probably give yourself credit for, but even strong people need help sometimes. There ain't no shame in that." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Mary stirred between them, and Cole glanced down at the baby with an expression so tender it made Grace's heart ache. "She looks like you," he said softly. "Got your eyes." "She has her father's hair," Grace managed to say. "And his stubborn streak, I think." Cole laughed quietly. "Well, stubbornness ain't always a bad trait. Keeps you fighting when things get hard." He stepped back, giving Grace space to breathe again. "I should let you get back to your day, but Mrs. Coleman, I meant what I said yesterday. If you need anything, anything at all, you come find me. I will be in town for a while yet." After Cole left, Grace sat on her bed holding Mary and trying to understand the strange feelings swirling in her chest. She barely knew this man. He was a drifter, a cowboy with no permanent home, someone who would ride out of Sioux Falls in a few weeks and never look back. Getting attached to him would be foolish and dangerous. But Grace could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at Mary, the gentleness in his hands when he had set down her supplies, the old pain in his eyes when he spoke about his mother. She recognized something in Cole Rutherford, a kindred loneliness, a soul trying to outrun its own grief. That evening, Mrs. Henderson brought up a pot of stew and some fresh bread, and she sat with Grace while they ate. The seamstress was a widow herself, her husband having died in the same mine collapse that took Thomas, and there was an understanding between them that needed no words. "I saw you walking with that cowboy today," Mrs. Henderson said casually as she buttered a piece of bread. "The one who has been staying at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He helped me carry some supplies. That is all." Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly. "He seems like a decent sort. Mrs. Patterson says he pays his rent on time and keeps his room clean. That is more than can be said for most of the men who pass through town." "He is leaving in a few weeks," Grace said, more to remind herself than to inform Mrs. Henderson. "Maybe," the older woman said. "Or maybe he will find a reason to stay. Sioux Falls has a way of keeping people who are meant to be here." Grace did not respond to that, but later, after Mrs. Henderson left and Mary was asleep, she stood at the window again and wondered what it would be like if Cole did stay. Wondered what it would be like to talk to him again, to learn more about his life on the trail, to see that gentle smile directed at her. She told herself to stop being ridiculous. Thomas had been dead only 3 months. It was too soon to be thinking about another man, too soon to be feeling anything except grief. But grief was exhausting, and Grace was so tired of being sad all the time. Cole Rutherford had made her feel something other than despair, and she could not bring herself to regret that, even if it was foolish. The next few days passed in a strange new rhythm. Grace went about her usual routines, caring for Mary and doing odd jobs for Mrs. Henderson and other townspeople to earn extra money. But now, whenever she went out, she found herself looking for Cole. And more often than not, she would spot him somewhere in town, working odd jobs himself, fixing a fence for the livery stable or helping load supplies at the freight office. They would wave to each other across the street, or sometimes Cole would make his way over to talk for a few minutes, asking about Mary and making small conversation that felt surprisingly natural. Grace learned that he was from Austin, that he had been working as a horse breaker for a ranch outside of town, that he loved the freedom of the trail but sometimes missed having a place to call home. Cole learned that Grace had grown up in Ohio, that she had met Thomas when he came through her town looking for work, that they had only been married 2 years before the accident. He never pressed for more information than she was willing to give, and Grace appreciated his restraint. A week after their first meeting, Cole invited Grace to have dinner with him at the restaurant on Main Street. Grace's first instinct was to refuse, but Mrs. Henderson had overheard the invitation and practically shoved Grace out the door, promising to watch Mary for a few hours. The restaurant was a simple place, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of home cooking, but to Grace it felt impossibly fancy. She could not remember the last time she had eaten a meal she had not prepared herself. Cole held out her chair and ordered them both the special, which turned out to be pot roast with potatoes and carrots, and they talked while they ate. Cole told her about his years on the trail, about the cattle drives and the dangerous river crossings, about sleeping under the stars and waking to the sound of coyotes howling in the distance. He made it sound romantic and adventurous, but Grace could hear the loneliness underneath his words. Grace told him about her marriage to Thomas, about their dreams of saving enough money to buy a small farm, about how happy they had been despite not having much. She talked about Mary's birth, about the terror and joy of becoming a mother, about how Thomas had cried when he first held his daughter. And then she told him about the mine collapse, about the awful moment when the foreman came to her door with his hat in his hands, about the weeks afterward when she could barely function except to care for Mary. Cole listened without interrupting, his blue eyes full of understanding and sympathy. "You are one of the strongest people I have ever met," he said quietly when she finished. "To go through all that and still be standing, still be taking care of your baby, still be fighting, that takes a kind of courage most people do not have." Grace shook her head. "I do not feel strong. Most days I feel like I am barely holding myself together." "That is what courage is," Cole said. "Holding yourself together when everything wants to break apart. That is the real kind of strength, not the flashy kind you see in dime novels." After dinner, Cole walked Grace back to the seamstress shop. The evening air was cool, carrying the first real hint of autumn, and Grace pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. At the bottom of the stairs leading to her room, Cole paused. "Mrs. Coleman, I know this might be forward of me, but I have really enjoyed spending time with you these past few days. Would you be opposed to me calling on you? Proper like, I mean." Grace's heart began beating faster. "Mr. Rutherford, Cole, I appreciate the sentiment, but I am still mourning my husband. It has only been 3 months. It would not be appropriate for me to be courted by another man so soon." Cole nodded slowly. "I understand that, and I respect it. But Grace, if I may call you that, I have not felt this way about anyone in a long time. Maybe ever. I ain't asking you to forget your husband or to stop grieving. I am just asking for a chance to get to know you better, to spend time with you without any expectations or pressure. And if all we ever are is friends, well, I would count myself lucky to have you as a friend." Grace looked up at him, at this good man who had appeared in her life at exactly the moment she needed him most, and felt something shift inside her. She was not ready for love again. She might never be ready, but she was tired of being alone, tired of carrying all her burdens by herself. "Friends would be nice," she said softly. "I could use a friend." Cole's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Friends it is, then." Over the next 2 weeks, Cole became a constant presence in Grace's life. He would stop by in the mornings before heading to work, bringing fresh bread from the bakery or a newspaper for Grace to read. He would join her for lunch, and they would sit in the small park near the church while Mary napped. In the evenings, after his work was done, he would help Grace with whatever tasks needed doing, fixing a loose board in her floor or hauling water up the stairs so she did not have to make so many trips. Mrs. Henderson watched this developing friendship with approval, often making herself scarce when Cole visited. The other townspeople began to talk, as people in small towns always do, but the talk was mostly positive. Everyone had seen Grace's struggle since Thomas died, and most folks were happy to see her getting help from a decent man. Grace tried to keep her feelings in check, tried to remember that Cole was her friend and nothing more, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. She noticed things about him that made her heart flutter. The way he was so gentle with Mary, holding her with the careful attention of someone afraid of breaking something precious. The way he laughed, a deep, genuine sound that made Grace want to laugh too. The way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was not paying attention, with an expression that made her feel seen in a way she had not felt since Thomas died. But she was also aware that Cole had not mentioned staying in Sioux Falls permanently. He had extended his stay at the boarding house twice now, but he still talked about the trail, about the next job waiting for him down in Kansas. Grace knew better than to build her hopes on a foundation that might disappear at any moment. One afternoon in mid-October, Cole asked Grace if she would like to go for a ride with him. He had borrowed a wagon from the livery stable, and he promised to have her back before dark. Grace hesitated, but Mary had been fussy all morning, and the idea of getting out of town for a few hours was appealing, so she agreed. They drove out along the Big Sioux River, following the rutted road that led toward the prairie. The autumn colors were at their peak, the cottonwoods along the riverbank blazing gold against the blue sky. Cole pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the area, and Grace relaxed into the simple pleasure of being outdoors on a beautiful day. Eventually, Cole pulled the wagon to a stop at a spot where the river widened into a calm pool. He helped Grace down and spread a blanket on the grass, and they sat watching the water flow past while Mary slept between them. "I have been thinking," Cole said after a long, comfortable silence, "about what I want to do with my life." Grace glanced at him. "What have you decided?" "I think I am tired of running," he said slowly. "I have spent the last 2 years telling myself I was seeking adventure, but really I was just avoiding going home and facing my responsibilities. My mother needs help with the ranch and I should be there providing it, but I have found something here in Sioux Falls that I did not expect to find." Grace's heart began beating faster. "What is that?" Cole turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes intense. "You. I have found you, Grace, and if I am being completely honest, I do not want to leave." Grace felt like she could not breathe. "Cole, I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything yet," he replied. "I know it is too soon for you. I know you are still grieving Thomas, and I ain't trying to replace him. But Grace, I am falling in love with you. I think I started falling the first day I saw you in that store, trying so hard to be brave while your world was crumbling. And every day since then, every conversation we have had, every moment I have spent with you and Mary, I have fallen a little bit more." Tears were streaming down Grace's face now, but she was not sure if they were tears of sadness or joy or confusion. "Thomas has only been gone 3 months. I should not be feeling anything for anyone else yet." "Should not according to who?" Cole asked gently. "Grace, there ain't no rules for how grief works or how long it takes, and loving someone new does not mean you love Thomas any less. Your heart is big enough for both." "I am scared," Grace whispered. "I lost Thomas so suddenly. What if something happens to you too?" Cole reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with warmth and strength. "I cannot promise nothing will ever happen to me, Grace. Life is uncertain, and this is hard country. But I can promise that every day I have, I will spend loving you and Mary and building a life worth living. That has got to count for something." Grace looked down at their joined hands, at the baby sleeping peacefully beside them, at the river flowing past on its eternal journey. She thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared and the life they had been building together. And then she thought about Cole, about his kindness and patience, about the way he had given her back everything she tried to sell without expecting anything in return. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she admitted quietly. "And it terrifies me." Cole smiled, that beautiful, transforming smile. "Being terrified is all right. We will be terrified together." He leaned forward slowly, giving Grace time to pull away if she wanted to, and pressed his lips gently against her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion but of promise, and Grace felt something inside her begin to heal. Over the next month, Grace and Cole's relationship deepened. They were careful to be respectful of propriety, always meeting in public places or with Mrs. Henderson as a chaperone, but their feelings for each other grew stronger with each passing day. Cole had written to his mother, explaining that he had found someone special in Sioux Falls and asking for her understanding about delaying his return home. His mother's response had been enthusiastic, telling him that love was precious and should be pursued whenever it appeared. In early November, Cole took Grace to meet the pastor at the church. They sat in his office while Mary played on a blanket on the floor, and Cole explained that he wanted to marry Grace, but was concerned about the appearance of unseemly haste given that her husband had only been dead 4 months. The pastor, a wise old man named Reverend Thompson, listened carefully and then smiled. "Son, I knew Thomas Coleman. He was a good man who loved his wife dearly, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that if he were here right now, he would want Grace to be happy and cared for. He would want his daughter to have a father who loved her. There is no shame in finding love again, even quickly, when that love is genuine and good." Grace felt tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. She had been carrying guilt about her feelings for Cole, worried that moving on so quickly meant she had not truly loved Thomas. But hearing the pastor's words gave her permission to let go of that guilt. "There is something else," Cole said, reaching into his vest pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I received word yesterday from my mother. My uncle died last month and left me a piece of land just outside Austin. It is about 100 acres with a small house and a creek running through it. It ain't much, but it is ours if we want it, a place to build a life." Grace stared at him. "You want me to move to Texas with you?" "I want you to marry me and move to Texas with me," Cole corrected. "I want to give Mary my name and raise her as my own daughter. I want to build you a bigger house and fill it with more children if you want them. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. What do you say, Grace? Will you take a chance on a reformed drifter cowboy?" Grace looked at Mary, who was chewing on her own fist and watching them with those serious green eyes. She thought about the tiny room above the seamstress shop, about the struggle of trying to survive alone in Sioux Falls. And then she thought about Texas, about 100 acres and a creek and a man who loved her daughter as if she were his own. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, Cole Rutherford, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church. Grace wore a dress that Mrs. Henderson had sewn for her, a beautiful deep blue that brought out her eyes. Cole wore a new suit he had purchased specially for the occasion, and he looked so handsome, Grace could barely breathe when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. The whole town turned out for the wedding, happy to see something joyful happen to the young widow who had suffered so much loss. Mrs. Henderson cried through the entire ceremony, and even the crusty old merchant from the general store got misty-eyed when Cole promised to love and cherish Grace for all his days. After the ceremony, there was a reception at the church hall with food donated by various townspeople and music provided by a fiddle player from the saloon. Cole and Grace danced their first dance as husband and wife, with Mary sleeping peacefully in Mrs. Henderson's arms nearby. "I cannot believe this is real," Grace whispered as Cole spun her around the floor. "A month ago, I was selling everything I owned just to feed my baby, and now I have a husband and a home waiting for me in Texas." "It is real," Cole murmured against her hair, "and it is going to get even better. I promise you, Grace, I am going to spend every day of my life making you happy." They left for Texas 2 days after the wedding, their belongings packed in a wagon along with supplies for the journey. The trip took 3 weeks, traveling south through Nebraska and Kansas before finally crossing into Texas. It was a hard journey with cold nights and uncertain roads, but Grace had never been happier. She and Cole talked for hours as they traveled, learning everything about each other, building the foundation of their life together. Mary thrived on the journey, as if she sensed the excitement and possibility ahead. Cole was wonderful with her, singing her silly songs and making her laugh, treating her with the same love and care he would show his own child. When they finally arrived at the land outside Austin in early December, Grace fell in love immediately. The house was small but well built, with a stone fireplace and windows that let in plenty of light. The land rolled gently toward a creek lined with cedar trees, and Grace could see cattle grazing in the distance on neighboring properties. Cole's mother came to visit the day after they arrived. A strong, weathered woman named Catherine who hugged Grace like a long-lost daughter and cooed over Mary with genuine delight. She had brought supplies and food, and she helped Grace set up the house while Cole met with the ranch hands who would help him work the land. "My son is a different man than the one who left here 2 years ago," Catherine told Grace as they hung curtains in the bedroom. "He has found purpose again, and that is because of you. Thank you for giving him a reason to come home." Grace felt tears prick her eyes for what seemed like the 100th time since meeting Cole. "He saved my life," she said softly. "I do not know what would have happened to Mary and me if he had not walked into that store when he did." Catherine squeezed her hand. "Then you saved each other. That is the best kind of love." That first winter in Texas was cold but wonderful. Cole worked hard building up the ranch, buying cattle and horses and slowly transforming the raw land into a working spread. Grace kept the house and cared for Mary, learning to cook Texas-style meals from Catherine and making friends with the neighboring ranch wives. And every night, Cole would come home tired and dusty, but he would always take time to hold Mary and talk to Grace about their day. He made her feel cherished and valued, not just as a wife but as a partner in building their life together. In the spring, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. Cole was overjoyed, spinning her around the kitchen, and then immediately apologizing and setting her down gently as if she might break. Mary was walking now, toddling around the house and getting into everything, and Grace could hardly believe how much had changed in just 6 months. Their son was born in October of 1880, almost exactly a year after Cole had walked into that general store in Sioux Falls. They named him Thomas, after Grace's first husband, and Cole held his son with the same tender care he showed Mary. "You do not mind?" Grace asked him one night as they lay in bed with baby Thomas sleeping between them. "That I wanted to name him after Thomas?" Cole kissed her forehead. "Grace, Thomas was your husband and Mary's father, and he deserves to be remembered. I ain't threatened by that. There is room in our family for honoring the past while building the future." Over the next few years, their family and ranch both flourished. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Catherine after Cole's mother, and another son they named Samuel. Mary grew into a bright, curious child who loved helping her father with the horses. The ranch became profitable, and Cole's reputation as a fair employer and skilled horseman spread throughout the county. Grace often thought back to that terrible day in Sioux Falls when she had stood at the counter of the general store, selling everything she owned. She thought about how desperate and alone she had felt, how certain she had been that her life was over. And then she would look around at her busy, noisy, wonderful household full of children and love, and she would marvel at how wrong she had been. One evening in the summer of 1885, Grace and Cole sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. Mary was 10 now, helping to teach 5-year-old Thomas how to rope the fence posts. Catherine was 3, chasing chickens with more enthusiasm than skill, and 2-year-old Samuel was content to dig in the dirt. "You ever regret it?" Cole asked suddenly. "Marrying me so quickly? Moving all the way to Texas?" Grace turned to look at her husband, at the man who had bought everything she owned and given it all back to her, along with a life she had never imagined possible. His face was more weathered now, with lines around his eyes from squinting in the sun, but those blue eyes were the same as the day she met him. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "You gave me more than just material things that day, Cole. You gave me hope when I had none left. You gave me a future when I could not see past the next day. You gave me love when I thought I would never feel it again." Cole pulled her close, and Grace rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "I was the one who got lucky," he murmured. "Walking into that store and finding you. Best $20 I ever spent." Grace laughed, that clear, joyful laugh that had come back to her slowly over the years. "The best investment of your life." "Absolutely," Cole agreed. "Though I will admit, I never did give those items to my mother and sister like I said I would." Grace pulled back to look at him in surprise. "What? Why not?" Cole grinned a little sheepishly. "Because I could not bear to part with them. I kept that tablecloth and locket, Grace. They are in the trunk in our bedroom. I kept them because they were yours, because they were part of the woman I was falling in love with. I figured someday I would give them to Mary, tell her the story of how her mother was the bravest, strongest woman I ever met." Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. "You are impossible, Cole Rutherford." "I know," he said, kissing her softly, "but I am your impossible man, and you are stuck with me." As the sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Grace thought about the long, unlikely journey that had brought her here. From the darkness of grief and desperation to the light of love and family. From a tiny room in South Dakota to a ranch in Texas. From a widow with nothing to a wife and mother with everything that mattered. Mary came running up to the porch then, her dark hair flying behind her, Thomas Coleman's daughter and Cole Rutherford's child both. "Mama, Papa, come see what Thomas and I built." Cole stood and pulled Grace to her feet, and together they walked into the yard where their children waited. The evening air was warm and sweet with the smell of prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance, cattle were lowing as the ranch hands brought them in for the night. This was her life now. This beautiful, messy, wonderful life full of noise and laughter and love. Grace had sold everything she owned to feed her baby, and a cowboy had bought it all and given it back to her. But more than that, he had given her a second chance at happiness, a chance she had seized with both hands and turned into a lifetime of joy. Years later, when Mary was grown with children of her own, she would ask her mother to tell her the story of how she and Cole met. And Grace would pull out the old tablecloth and locket, carefully preserved all those years, and she would tell her daughter about a desperate day in Sioux Falls, and a cowboy with kind blue eyes who had saved her life with a simple act of generosity. "Love comes when you least expect it," Grace would tell her daughter. "Sometimes it comes in the form of a stranger who sees you at your lowest moment and decides to help anyway. Your father taught me that there is still goodness in this world, even when everything seems dark. And that lesson, that gift of hope, is the most valuable thing anyone ever gave me." And Mary would hug her mother and understand that the true gift had not been the money or the returned possessions, but the love that had grown from that first moment of kindness. A love that had sustained through hardships and celebrated through joys. A love that had built a family and a home and a legacy that would endure for generations. In the end, Grace and Cole's story became part of the family history, passed down through the years as an example of how love could bloom even in the harshest circumstances. How a single act of compassion could change the entire trajectory of a life. The ranch they built together remained in the family for over 100 years, a testament to the strength of two people who found each other at exactly the right moment and chose to build something beautiful together. Grace lived to be 83 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them descended from that desperate young widow in Sioux Falls who had been saved by a cowboy with $20 and a generous heart. And when she finally passed peacefully in her sleep, she was buried next to Cole on a hill overlooking the land they had cultivated together, their gravestones side by side just as they had been in life. The inscription on Grace's stone read simply, "She was strong when strength was all she had." And on Cole's, "He saw the best in people and brought it out." Together, they told the story of a love that had transcended loss and hardship to become something enduring and true. And in that small cemetery outside Austin, Texas, the prairie wind blew gently over their resting place, carrying with it the whispers of a story that had begun with an act of kindness in a general store and had ended, many decades later, with a legacy of love that would never be forgotten. The tablecloth and locket remained in the family, carefully preserved and brought out on special occasions, tangible reminders of the day everything changed, the day a cowboy bought everything a desperate woman was selling and gave it all back to her, along with his heart.